film opens on a distant and otherworldly planet known as Barsoom. This harsh, alien world is divided into three dominant powers: the noble city of Helium, the aggressive empire of Zidanga, and the nomadic, fearsome Tharks. For generations, Helium and Zidanga have been locked in a relentless war. Early on, we witness a massive battlefield where Helium's soldiers, draped in blue, clash violently with Zidanga's red-clad forces. Amid this chaos, Zidanga's commander, Sabthan, is approached by three mysterious figures. They claim to serve divine beings called the Tharks. Their leader, Madai Shang, presents Sabthan with a strange weapon glowing with blue energy, telling him it is a gift chosen for him by a goddess. The Tharks reveal their intention to support Zidanga in the war. They wield control over a powerful force known as the Ninth Ray, a form of energy that grants them abilities far beyond any ordinary being on Barsoom. The story then shifts dramatically to Earth, New York City, 1881. A young man named Edgar Rice Burroughs receives word from his uncle, John Carter, and is summoned to the city. Upon arrival at the station, he is met by Carter's loyal butler, who escorts him to an enormous estate. Edgar quickly learns that his uncle, once a Confederate Army captain and now a wealthy man, has passed away unexpectedly. Carter's lawyer informs Edgar that he has inherited his uncle's entire fortune. Still processing the shock, Edgar is taken to Carter's mausoleum, where his body is preserved. One strange detail stands out: the tomb can only be opened from the inside. Before leaving, the lawyer hands Edgar a personal journal left behind by Carter, with strict instructions that only Edgar should read it. Once alone, Edgar begins turning its pages. The diary opens with a personal note. John explains that Edgar was the only person who ever believed his unbelievable stories as a child, and so he feels compelled to tell him the truth. The narrative then moves back in time, to the American Southwest following the Civil War. John Carter, now a former Confederate officer, is wandering the desert in search of gold. During his journey, he is captured by Union Colonel Powell, who wants him to join a cavalry unit fighting the Apache. Carter refuses outright. He's done with war and refuses to be dragged into another. After multiple attempts to break free, Carter finally escapes by knocking out a guard and stealing a horse. Powell and his men give chase. Not long after, they run into a group of Apache warriors, triggering a violent gunfight. In the confusion, Carter tries to slip away, but when he sees Powell wounded, he makes a surprising choice. He helps him. Seeking shelter, Carter leads Powell into a nearby cave, one he's never come across before, despite all his searching. Inside, he lights a match and is stunned to find the cave ceiling embedded with gold. But before he can react, a mysterious man appears behind him out of thin air. The stranger is one of the same Tharks seen earlier. Powell warns Carter just in time, and a fight breaks out. Carter manages to shoot the man, who, as he dies, whispers a single word, Barsoom, while staring at a strange medallion in his hand. Carter takes the medallion and repeats the word. Instantly, a blinding blue light erupts. When he opens his eyes, everything has changed. He finds himself in a vast desert unlike anything on Earth. As he tries to move, he realizes something is off. His body behaves differently here. He struggles to walk, almost floating and stumbling as if gravity itself has weakened. Gradually, he experiments, learning to control his movements. Soon, he climbs a hill and witnesses a bizarre sight: large eggs cracking open. Before he can process it, a group of towering green creatures with multiple limbs appears, riding massive beasts. Their leader confronts him, triggering a sudden reaction. Carter leaps high into the air without intending to. The creatures prepare to attack but stop when their leader commands them. Speaking in a language Carter cannot understand, the leader introduces himself as Tarkas. When Carter says his full name, John Carter of Virginia, the creatures misunderstand and begin calling him simply Virginia. Tarkas orders Carter to jump again, but Carter refuses and lashes out instead. The creatures overpower him, injure him, and take him prisoner. It's here that we learn these beings are the Tharks. Elsewhere on Barsoom, we meet Princess Dejah Thoris of Helium. She is presenting a revolutionary weapon she has designed to her father, the king. Helium is on the brink of defeat, largely due to the Tharks aiding Zidanga. Dejah has uncovered the secret behind the Ninth Ray and attempts to demonstrate her invention, but the device suddenly malfunctions and explodes. Unknown to her, it has been sabotaged. Meanwhile, Sabthan seeks to end the war through marriage, by forcing Dejah to become his wife. She firmly refuses, knowing that if she agrees, he will gain control over Helium and eventually dominate the entire planet. Back with the Tharks, Carter is brought to their city and placed among newly hatched young. During the night, a female Thark named Sola gives him a strange liquid. After consuming it, Carter gains the ability to understand their language. The next day, Carter is forced to demonstrate his jumping ability before a crowd. During this, he notices that Tarkas possesses the medallion, the only thing that can return him home. Suddenly, attention shifts to the sky, where two massive warships clash. Helium and Zidanga are battling once again. The Tharks watch with amusement, treating the deadly conflict as entertainment and even placing bets. In the middle of the fight, Dejah is thrown from her ship. Without hesitation, Carter uses his newfound abilities to leap into action and save her midair. The Tharks erupt in excitement as Carter joins Dejah in combat, taking on Zidanga's soldiers with incredible strength. Together, they manage to shift the momentum of the battle in Helium's favor, but ultimately, the ship crashes. Now stranded, Dejah and Carter find themselves surrounded by the Tharks. Impressed by Carter's power, Tarkas names him his second-in-command. Carter isn't entirely comfortable with this new role, but he doesn't resist. Later, Dejah explains the truth to him. They are on Mars, known here as Barsoom. Carter struggles to accept it at first, insisting he's from Earth. But she clarifies that the planet's low gravity, combined with his physical makeup, is what gives him his extraordinary strength and ability to leap across vast distances. Determined to show him more, Dejah leads Carter to a sacred Thark temple, a place where humans are strictly forbidden to enter, and this is where things begin to change even further. Dejah brings John to the sacred temple with a specific purpose. She believes the answers to his arrival lie hidden within its ancient secrets. Sola trails behind them quietly, urging them to turn back before it's too late. Ignoring her warnings, Dejah leads John deeper inside and shows him a towering statue of the goddess Isis. As she studies the carvings etched into the stone, she begins translating the inscriptions, hoping to uncover the truth. But their intrusion doesn't go unnoticed. Before long, Thark guards storm in and arrest all three of them. The punishment is immediate, death for violating the temple. They are locked in a cell, awaiting execution. Tarkas steps in and orders everyone out, claiming he wants to deal with the prisoners personally. He pretends he's about to mutilate John as punishment, but once they're alone, his tone shifts completely. He reveals a secret: Sola is his daughter, and despite Thark traditions, he refuses to let them die. Tarkas returns John's medallion and tells him to seek out the river Is. According to him, that is the only place where the mystery of Isis, and perhaps John's way home, can be understood. Not long after, the guards grow suspicious and check the cell, only to realize the prisoners are gone. Tarkas's betrayal is exposed. Seizing the opportunity, his ruthless rival Tal Hajjus steps forward, takes control, and declares himself the new Jeddak of the Tharks. Meanwhile, John, Dejah, and Sola begin their journey toward the river Is. Dejah takes the lead, guiding them across the desert, but Sola quietly reveals the truth to John. Dejah isn't heading to the river at all. She's taking him to Helium. When confronted, Dejah admits it. She intended to bring John back as a weapon, a powerful ally in the war. Hearing this, John feels used. Frustrated and disappointed, he chooses to part ways, asking Sola to guide him instead, leaving Dejah behind. But Dejah doesn't give up. She explains her desperation. Marrying Sab then would mean losing everything, including her freedom and her people. Realizing she has no other choice, John allows her to join them again, and the three continue together. Their journey leads them through the river Is, eventually arriving at a colossal inverted pyramid rising from the landscape. Drawn by curiosity, John and Dejah climb to the top. What they discover there changes everything. A strange blue energy pulses across the ground, alive, shifting, powerful. Dejah immediately recognizes it. This is the ninth ray, the same force she had been studying. She begins to piece things together, realizing that this energy may be responsible for transporting John from Earth to Barsoom by converting and projecting his physical form across space. Before they can explore further, danger arrives. An army of Warhoons suddenly emerges, led by none other than Matai Shang. Outnumbered, John tells Dejah and Sola to run while he stays behind to hold them off. Just as the situation turns hopeless, reinforcements appear. Helium's forces arrive in time, turning the tide of battle. Together, they drive back the Warhoons. John survives the encounter but is left wounded. He is taken back to Helium to recover. Dejah returns home and is reunited with her father, but the moment is far from peaceful. Sab then is already there, having arrived unarmed under the guise of negotiation. He offers marriage as a solution to end the war. With Helium on the brink of collapse and no alternatives left, Dejah reluctantly agrees, sacrificing her freedom to save her people. Elsewhere in the palace, John rests as he recovers. Under Dejah's orders, a trusted soldier secretly escorts him to her chamber. She urges him to use the medallion and return to Earth, away from all this conflict. But just as guards enter the room, John vanishes. Dejah assumes he has left for Earth. In reality, he remains hidden nearby. Once the guards move on, he attempts to slip away, but before he can escape, he is confronted by Mad-Eye Shang. John is stunned to see Shang effortlessly change his appearance, shifting into different forms. It becomes clear the Tharks are far more powerful than they seemed. Across the city, preparations for the royal wedding are underway. Mad-Eye Shang captures John and restrains him using advanced Ninth Ray technology. A device locked onto his wrist renders him powerless, controlling his movements completely. With cold precision, Shang reveals the truth. Sab then never intended to honor the marriage. Once the ceremony is complete, he plans to kill Dja and take full control of Helium. The Tharks supported him because he was easy to manipulate, but Shang's real ambition goes far beyond that. He intends to rule all of Barsoom through him. Just as Shang prepares to eliminate John, something unexpected happens. The strange alien dog John had befriended earlier suddenly leaps in, attacking Shang and destroying the control device on his wrist. Freed at last, John wastes no time. He escapes, commandeering a flying craft in a desperate attempt to reach the wedding, but he has no idea how to pilot it. Within moments, the craft spirals out of control and crashes right into Thark territory. Once again, John is captured. This time he finds Tarkas imprisoned as well, beaten and weakened. Tal Hajus, now ruling the Tharks, throws both of them into a brutal arena filled with enormous white apes. What follows is pure chaos. John fights with everything he has, using his strength and agility to take down the massive creatures in front of a roaring crowd. Against all odds, he defeats them. The Tharks are stunned. Seizing the moment, John challenges Tal Hajus directly and defeats him without hesitation. The crowd erupts. John is declared the new leader of the Tharks. With his newfound authority, he rallies them, convincing the entire tribe to stand with him against Zidanga. Together, they march toward Helium. The wedding is already underway when John arrives. He bursts in just as Sab then attempts to carry out his plan. Intervening at the last second, John stops him, and a full-scale battle erupts. This time, however, Helium is not alone. The Tharks join the fight, shifting the balance completely. Zidanga's forces are overwhelmed and ultimately defeated. In the chaos, Mad-Eye Shang escapes, taking John's medallion with him. With the war finally over, John makes his choice. He stays. He and Dja are married, and John becomes the Prince of Helium. The next morning, the two stand together on a palace balcony, looking out over a peaceful city. For a moment, it feels like everything has finally settled, but it doesn't last. As Dja steps away, Mad-Eye Shang suddenly appears. John tries to fight back, but without the medallion, he is powerless. Shang activates it, and in an instant, John is torn away from Barsoom. When he opens his eyes, he is back on Earth. He lies inside the cave, now aged, covered in dust, his beard long, proof that years have passed. Nearby, he finds the remains of Colonel Powell, confirming how much time has gone by. The gold in the cave makes him rich, but without the medallion, he is trapped. Refusing to give up, John spends the next 10 years searching. He builds a mining empire, convinced that more medallions exist somewhere on Earth. Eventually, he finds one, but he also realizes something else. The Tharks have been watching him all along. He understands now that his body on Earth must remain safe while his consciousness travels. If it's destroyed, he dies on both worlds. That's why his tomb was designed to open only from the inside. He stages his own death. In his diary, he leaves instructions for Edgar: protect the mausoleum from the Tharks, and in return, everything he owns will belong to him. Shaken, Edgar rushes to the tomb and unlocks it using the word Ned, a nickname from their past. As the door opens, a Thark reveals himself, having followed Edgar, but before the creature can strike, it is suddenly knocked unconscious from behind. John Carter stands there. He takes the Thark's medallion and reveals the truth. He never actually found one during his search. This was all part of his plan. By faking his death, he lured a Thark into revealing itself, just to take the medallion. Before leaving, he asks Edgar to guard the mausoleum. Then, without hesitation, he lies down inside, gripping the medallion. As he whispers the word once more, the energy begins to rise again. Barsoom. Sometimes, a movie doesn't just release. It arrives already carrying a verdict. Before audiences even sit down, before the lights dim, before the first frame has a chance to speak for itself, the story around the film has already taken over. And that is exactly what happened with John Carter. For a lot of people, this movie was never allowed to simply be a movie. It became a headline, a cautionary tale, a punchline, a symbol of excess, a box office story before it was ever truly treated like a piece of cinema. And that's important, because when a film gets trapped inside that kind of narrative, people stop watching what's actually on screen. They start watching the budget. They start watching the marketing campaign. They start watching the opening weekend numbers. And once that happens, the conversation changes completely. the movie itself becomes secondary. Everything around it becomes the main event. John Carter is one of the clearest examples of that. Its failure at the box office didn't just hurt the film financially. It shaped the way people talked about it, judged it, and remembered it. Suddenly, it wasn't being discussed as an ambitious science fantasy adventure. It was being discussed as the expensive Disney misfire. The film's identity became tied to what it cost, how badly it underperformed, and how quickly the industry turned it into a warning sign. That label stuck so hard that for many viewers, the phrase "box office bomb" became more familiar than anything the film actually tried to do. And once that reputation settled in, the backlash became almost self-sustaining. Because that's the thing about high-profile failures, they attract a kind of criticism that goes beyond normal disappointment. When a movie is expected to be huge and then stumbles, people don't just say it was flawed. They say it was disastrous. They don't say it didn't work for them. They say it collapsed. The response becomes bigger, harsher, louder, as if the financial failure itself becomes proof that the movie must also be artistically worthless. And, in the case of John Carter, that assumption seemed to set in almost immediately. The film became cool to dismiss. Not because everyone carefully weighed its strengths and weaknesses and came to the same conclusion, but because once a movie gets publicly branded as a failure, a lot of people begin responding to the reputation instead of the experience. The backlash starts feeding itself. Critics sharpen their knives. Audiences lower their expectations. Casual viewers go in expecting a train wreck. And when people expect a film to fail, they often interpret everything through that lens. That doesn't mean the criticism came from nowhere. John Carter does have real flaws. But the intensity of the reaction often feels larger than those flaws alone can explain. Because what surrounded this film was not just criticism, it was an atmosphere of disappointment, mockery, and suspicion. Suspicion toward the budget, suspicion toward the studio, suspicion toward the idea that this was supposed to be a major franchise launch. And when all of that builds before the movie has had a fair chance to stand on its own, the response becomes distorted. That's why the film's reputation is such a fascinating part of its story. Because if you actually look at the reaction closely, what you find isn't unanimous rejection. You find division. You find people who were surprised by how much they enjoyed it. You find viewers who thought the backlash was wildly exaggerated. You find people who looked past the box office disaster and saw an earnest, visually ambitious, often entertaining adventure that never deserved to be spoken about like a cinematic catastrophe. And that gap between the movie's public image and many people's actual experience of watching it is where the real story begins. There's a difference between a flawed movie and a doomed one. A flawed movie can still entertain, it can still impress, it can still build a following. It can still have value. But once the industry and the media lock a film into the identity of a failure, that nuance starts disappearing. John Carter stopped being discussed like a movie with mixed results and started being discussed like a giant public embarrassment. And that framing matters because it changes the emotional tone of every conversation around it. Instead of asking what worked and what didn't, the conversation became, how did this go so wrong? Instead of asking, is this film better than people say? People asked, why did this movie fail so hard? That is a huge difference. Because one question is about the art. The other is about the scandal. And John Carter spent so much of its life being viewed through scandal that its actual cinematic identity got buried underneath the noise. For years, people approached it as a case study instead of an adventure film. They came to it looking for evidence of failure, not for the possibility of surprise. And when that happens, a movie is already fighting an uphill battle. What makes it even more interesting is that a lot of the backlash seems tied not just to the film itself, but to what it represented. Big budget, big studio, big ambitions, franchise hopes. That kind of setup creates a strange environment where the fall becomes almost irresistible to watch. People love success stories, but they also love high-profile collapses. And John Carter became one of those collapses people were eager to talk about, whether or not they had any real interest in judging the actual work fairly. That's why its reputation feels so outsized. Because this wasn't simply a movie that disappointed some viewers. It became a symbol of overspending, a symbol of failed franchise planning, a symbol of bad studio judgment. And once a film becomes symbolic in that way, it stops being evaluated normally. Every weakness gets magnified, every strength gets overlooked. Every positive reaction feels like a defense brief rather than a genuine opinion. But the truth is, movies are not numbers. They are not headlines. They are not opening weekend narratives. And John Carter, whatever its flaws, deserves to be separated from the mythology of its failure long enough to be seen for what it actually is. Not what it earned, not what people said it was supposed to be, not what the internet turned it into, what it actually is on screen. Because when that happens, the conversation becomes much more interesting. The movie may still not work for everyone. Some people will still find it messy, uneven, or emotionally underwhelming. That's fair. But those are film criticisms. Those are artistic judgments. That is very different from dismissing it simply because history has already filed it away as a flop. And that distinction matters, especially for a movie like this, because John Carter was never judged in a calm environment. It was judged in the middle of a storm. And maybe that is why its reputation still feels so unfinished. Because beneath the box office headlines and the critical backlash there has always been another response quietly growing around it, one built on rediscovery, on lowered expectations turning into pleasant surprise, on viewers realizing that the film is nowhere near as disastrous as its legacy suggests. Not perfect, not misunderstood genius, but certainly not the complete creative collapse it was made out to be. In the end, John Carter didn't just fail at the box office. It got swallowed by the story of that failure. And once that happened, its reputation became larger, harsher, and more permanent than the film itself probably deserved. That doesn't erase its problems, but it does force us to ask an important question. Did John Carter really earn its reputation? Or did its reputation arrive first and decide the answer for everyone else? Sometimes a movie doesn't fail because of what it is. It fails because nobody understands what it's supposed to be. And that's exactly where John Carter ran into one of its biggest problems, not on screen, but long before audiences ever bought a ticket. Because when this film was introduced to the world, the question wasn't, is this exciting? The question was, what even is this? That confusion didn't come from the story itself. It came from the way the movie was presented. The marketing never found a clear identity. Trailers showed scale. Deserts, flying ships, strange creatures, massive battles, but they never anchored that scale to something emotionally or narratively compelling. There was spectacle, yes, but no hook, no clear reason to care. No strong sense of character, tone, or purpose that audiences could immediately latch onto. It looked big, but it didn't feel specific. And in modern blockbuster culture, that's a serious problem. Because audiences are not just sold on visuals anymore, they're sold on clarity. They need to understand, within seconds, what kind of experience they're being invited into. Is this a grounded sci-fi story? A fun adventure? A serious epic? A family-friendly fantasy? John Carter never answered that question cleanly. Instead, it hovered awkwardly between all of them. One moment, it looked like a massive science fiction spectacle. The next, it felt like a light, almost playful fantasy. Then suddenly, it hinted at romance, then action, then mythology. All of those elements are actually part of the film, but the marketing never unified them into a single, confident identity. It showed pieces, but never the full picture. And because of that, audiences couldn't immediately connect with it. Compare that to other major films in the same space. When something like Star Wars or Avatar presents itself, you instantly understand the tone, the stakes, the emotional core. There's a clarity there, a promise. You know what you're walking into. With John Carter, that promise was missing. And when a movie costs as much as this one did, that lack of clarity becomes dangerous, because now expectations start working against it. People begin asking, why is this so expensive? What makes this special? Why should I care? And if the marketing doesn't answer those questions quickly and convincingly, people simply move on. That's exactly what happened here. Despite the massive budget and aggressive push, the promotional material didn't create urgency. It didn't create curiosity. It didn't create that must-see feeling that drives opening weekend success. Instead, it left audiences uncertain. And uncertainty is the enemy of blockbuster momentum. But the issue goes even deeper than just unclear trailers. The film also struggled with positioning, where it belonged in the cultural landscape at the time. By the time John Carter arrived, audiences had already been immersed in massive science fantasy worlds. They had seen Avatar. They had grown up with Star Wars. They had experienced fully realized universes that felt both epic and immediately accessible. So when John Carter showed up, it didn't feel like the beginning of something new. It felt like something arriving late. Even though, historically, the source material came long before many of those stories. And that's the irony. This is a world that helped inspire generations of storytelling, but the marketing never communicated that. It never said, "This is where it all began." It never framed the film as a foundational piece of science fantasy history finally brought to life. Instead, it allowed audiences to see it as just another attempt to replicate something they had already experienced. And once that perception sets in, it's incredibly hard to reverse, because now the film isn't being judged as an original vision, it's being judged as a comparison. And comparisons, in this case, did not work in its favor. There's also the issue of tone again, not just what the film is, but who it's for. Was this a family adventure, a serious epic, a romantic fantasy, a high-concept sci-fi experience? The marketing tried to speak to everyone, and in doing so, it didn't fully connect with anyone. Families didn't immediately see it as essential. Hardcore sci-fi fans weren't sure if it was deep enough. General audiences didn't feel a strong pull toward a clear experience. It sat in the middle, and the middle is a difficult place to sell from. Because movies that succeed at scale usually plant a flag. They declare what they are, boldly and clearly. John Carter never quite did that. And when opening weekend came, that uncertainty showed. The weak initial response wasn't just about the film itself. It was about the absence of anticipation. People didn't rush to see it, not because they rejected it, but because they were never fully convinced they needed to see it in the first place. That's a critical difference. Rejection comes after interest, but here, interest never fully formed. And once a big-budget film opens without that momentum, the narrative shifts instantly. It becomes a failure, and everything that follows gets filtered through that label. Which brings us back to the bigger picture. Because what's fascinating about John Carter is that many people who eventually watched it, whether later in theaters, on home release, or through word of mouth, had a completely different reaction than the marketing suggested they would. They found it entertaining. They found it visually impressive. They found it fun, not perfect, but far from unwatchable. And that creates a strange disconnect. A movie that struggled to convince people to see it, but often surprised the ones who did. That gap between expectation and experience is where the marketing failure becomes most visible. Because marketing isn't just about selling tickets, it's about setting the right expectation. And in this case, the expectation was either unclear or completely misaligned. So the real question isn't just whether the marketing was weak, it's this. What if John Carter didn't fail to attract audiences because it lacked value, but because it never clearly communicated what that value was? What if the movie people thought they were getting wasn't the movie that was actually there? Because if that's true, then the film's biggest problem wasn't just execution, it was introduction. And sometimes, the way a story is introduced to the world decides its fate before the story even begins. Before John Carter was ever a movie, before the trailers, the budget, the backlash, there was a story that existed long before modern cinema even looked the way it does today. A story written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, a writer whose imagination didn't just entertain audiences, it helped shape the very DNA of modern adventure storytelling. Most people recognize his name because of Tarzan. That character became a global icon, adapted countless times across film, television, and literature. But John Carter, or more specifically, A Princess of Mars, is where things get even more interesting, because this wasn't just another pulp story. It was one of the earliest examples of large-scale science fantasy world-building. A fully realized alien planet, strange civilizations, advanced technology mixed with primitive cultures. A human outsider dropped into a foreign world, forced to adapt, evolve, and ultimately reshape the fate of that world. If any of that sounds familiar, it's because it should. Long before audiences ever experienced galaxies far, far away or lush alien ecosystems filled with towering creatures, Burroughs had already imagined something strikingly similar. Not identical, not modernized, but foundational. The kind of storytelling that doesn't just exist in isolation, but quietly influences everything that comes after it. And that's where John Carter the film finds itself in a uniquely complicated position. Because when audiences watch it today, they're not watching it in 1912. They're watching it after decades of science fiction evolution. They've already seen the worlds that were, in many ways, built on ideas like these. So instead of feeling like a bold original vision, the film risks feeling familiar, even derivative. But here's the twist. It's not borrowing from those stories. Those stories, in many ways, borrowed from this, and that reversal creates a strange kind of disconnect. Because if you don't know the history, John Carter can feel like it's repeating ideas you've already seen. But if you do know the history, it starts to feel like something else entirely, like a missing origin point. A story that laid the groundwork long before audiences were ready to fully appreciate it in cinematic form. That context matters a lot, because it changes how you interpret what you're watching. It turns what might seem like familiar tropes into early blueprints. It reframes the narrative from imitation into influence, and for some viewers, that realization elevates the entire experience. It becomes less about comparing John Carter to modern blockbusters and more about recognizing how deeply its roots run through the genre itself. Suddenly, the similarities aren't a weakness, they're a reminder of just how far-reaching Burroughs' imagination actually was. But at the same time, that legacy also raises expectations. Because when you're adapting something this influential, this foundational, this rich with history, you're not just telling a story, you're carrying the weight of everything that story represents. And that's where the film becomes more divisive. Some viewers see a genuine attempt to honor that legacy. They see a movie that embraces the scale, the adventure, the sincerity, and the sense of wonder that define Burroughs' work. They recognize the effort to bring Barsoom to life, not as a modern reinterpretation, but as a faithful realization of a classic vision. But others see something very different. They see a story that had far more depth to offer than what made it onto the screen. They see a world rich with culture, philosophy, and complexity, reduced to surface-level spectacle. They see characters that, in the books, carried weight and transformation, now feeling thinner, less defined, less emotionally grounded. And that's the core of the divide. It's not just about whether the movie is good or bad. It's about whether it truly captures what made the original material special. Because adapting something like this isn't just about recreating the plot. It's about translating the spirit, the sense of discovery, the cultural depth. The way the protagonist doesn't just move through the world, but is shaped by it, and in turn, reshapes it. Some viewers feel that translation worked. Others feel it only scratched the surface. And that tension is what makes John Carter such an interesting case study in adaptation. Because the film doesn't ignore its source. It clearly draws from it, visually and structurally. But at the same time, it compresses, reshapes, and simplifies that source in ways that don't always preserve its full impact. It tries to fit something expansive into a format that demands efficiency. And in doing so, it inevitably loses some of the nuance that made the original material resonate so deeply with readers. But even then, the legacy still lingers. Because no matter how you feel about the adaptation itself, the influence of Burroughs is impossible to ignore. His ideas didn't just stay on the page, they echoed across decades of storytelling, quietly shaping the genre long before audiences realized it. And that's what makes John Carter so unique. It's not just another adaptation. It's an adaptation of a story that helped define the language of adventure itself, which raises one final question. When you watch John Carter, are you seeing a film that arrived too late or a story that arrived long before its time? Because depending on your answer, you might be watching a missed opportunity or the cinematic echo of something that started it all. Adapting a story like John Carter isn't just a creative decision, it's a responsibility. Because you're not dealing with a simple, contained narrative, you're dealing with a world that already exists in the minds of readers. A world shaped by decades of imagination, expectation, and emotional attachment. And once you bring that world to the screen, one question immediately takes over everything else. Did they get it right? That question sits at the center of the John Carter debate. Because depending on who you ask, this film is either a respectful translation of a classic or a complete misunderstanding of what made that classic work in the first place. On one side, you have viewers who see genuine effort, even admiration, in the way the film approaches its source material. They recognize the broad strokes. The core premise is intact. The world of Barsoom is there. The key characters are present. The sense of large-scale adventure, of a man transported into an alien world and forced into conflict, still drives the narrative. There's an attempt to preserve the spirit. And for some, that's enough. They see a film that embraces the old-school pulp adventure tone of the original stories, a film that doesn't try to modernize everything into something darker or more cynical. Instead, it leans into sincerity. It leans into spectacle. It leans into the idea that this is meant to be an epic, sweeping journey, not a grounded, minimalist reinterpretation. In that sense, they view the adaptation as successful, not perfect, not complete, but faithful in its intent. But then, there's the other side. And this is where the conversation shifts. Because for many viewers, especially those familiar with the books, the issue isn't what the film includes, it's what it leaves behind. The criticism here isn't that the movie changed things. Every adaptation changes things. That's expected. The real problem, according to this perspective, is that the film tries to do too much and ends up doing less. It compresses, it condenses, it rushes. Instead of building the world step by step, allowing its cultures, politics, and relationships to unfold naturally, the film attempts to fit a massive, layered narrative into a structure that can't fully support it. Important elements are introduced, but not explored. Key ideas appear, but don't evolve. Moments that should carry weight pass by too quickly to leave a lasting impact, and the result is something that feels incomplete. Not because the material isn't there, but because it hasn't been given the space to breathe. This is where the adaptation begins to feel less like a translation and more like a reduction. Because in the original stories, the world of Barsoom isn't just a backdrop for action. It's a living system of cultures, belief systems, and social structures. The characters don't just exist to move the plot forward. They are shaped by that world, and they change within it. That depth is part of what made the source material resonate. And for many viewers, that's exactly what feels missing here. The film shows the world, but doesn't always fully explore it. It introduces the characters, but doesn't always fully develop them. It sets up ideas, but doesn't always follow through on them. And when that happens, something important gets lost. Because adaptation isn't just about transferring events from one medium to another. It's about translating meaning. And meaning requires time. It requires focus. It requires restraint. But John Carter often feels like it's in a hurry to introduce everything, a hurry to expand the scope, a hurry to set up what could have been a much larger franchise. And in that rush, it sacrifices the very thing that could have grounded it, the careful, layered storytelling that gave the original its weight. There's also the issue of changes. Some viewers point to specific alterations, especially in how certain elements of the story are presented or reimagined, and argue that these changes don't enhance the narrative. Instead, they simplify it. They make it more conventional, more aligned with familiar blockbuster structures, rather than the more distinctive approach of the source material. And that's where frustration starts to build, because the potential is visible. You can see glimpses of what this adaptation could have been, moments where the world feels rich. Moments where the characters begin to take shape, moments where the story hints at something deeper. But those moments are not consistent. They appear, and then they fade, which leads to a very specific kind of disappointment. Not the disappointment of something being completely broken, but the disappointment of something almost working. Because the foundation is strong, the source material is there, the world is there, the ambition is there, but the execution doesn't always match the potential. And that's why the conversation around this adaptation feels so divided. Some viewers are satisfied with what the film preserves, the scale, the adventure, the spirit. Others are frustrated by what it loses, the depth, the nuance, the emotional and cultural richness. Both perspectives are valid, because both are looking at the same film, but focusing on different things. One sees what made it through, the other sees what didn't. And John Carter lives right in the middle of that divide. It's not an adaptation that completely betrays its source, but it's also not one that fully captures everything that made the original special. It sits in that uncomfortable space between faithfulness and failure, where the intent is clear, but the result feels incomplete. Which raises a difficult question. Is it enough for an adaptation to honor the surface of a story if it doesn't fully deliver its depth? Because depending on your answer, John Carter is either a bold attempt that deserved more time, or a missed opportunity that had everything it needed and still couldn't quite become what it was meant to be. Every great adventure begins with a question. Not a complicated one, not a philosophical one, but a simple, irresistible spark. What happens if you take a man out of his world and drop him into another? That's the foundation of John Carter. At its core, the premise is classic, almost mythic in its simplicity. A soldier, worn down by war, disconnected from purpose, suddenly finds himself transported to a place that operates by completely different rules, not just geographically different, but physically, culturally, and morally. And that man is John Carter, a Civil War veteran. A fighter who has seen too much, lost too much, and wants nothing more to do with conflict. When we meet him, he's not a hero in the traditional sense. He's not chasing glory. He's not driven by duty. He's trying to walk away from it all. That's what makes the setup compelling. Because this isn't a story about a man seeking adventure. It's about a man who wants nothing to do with it and gets pulled into it anyway. And that pull comes from something mysterious. A cave, an encounter, an object that doesn't belong to his world. And in a moment that shifts everything, John Carter is no longer on Earth. He's on Barsoom, Mars, but not the Mars we think we know. This isn't a cold, empty planet. It's alive, it's divided, it's dangerous. It's filled with civilizations, conflicts, and creatures that immediately place Carter in a position of both advantage and vulnerability. Because the rules here are different. The gravity is lower, which means Carter can leap incredible distances, move faster, hit harder. Instantly, he becomes something more than human in this world. A physical anomaly. A man who can do things no one else can. But that advantage doesn't make him safe, because he's still an outsider. He doesn't understand the language. At first, he doesn't understand the politics. He doesn't understand the alliances, the rivalries, the history that defines this planet. And that's where the narrative setup starts to expand. Because John Carter isn't just about survival in a strange land. It's about becoming entangled in a conflict that was already in motion long before he arrived. Two major powers, a planet on the edge of domination, a princess caught in a political trap, a warlord with overwhelming power, and a hero who never intended to take part in any of it. That's the structure. Carter arrives as an observer but quickly becomes a participant. At first, his goal is simple: get home. Everything he does is driven by that motivation. He doesn't care about the war, he doesn't care about the politics, he doesn't care about who rules what. But the longer he stays, the more complicated things become. Because now there are people involved. Alliances begin to form, conflicts become personal, and the line between self-interest and responsibility starts to blur. That's where the premise shifts from exploration to engagement. And it's also where the film starts to lean into its larger narrative ambitions. Because this isn't just one story. It's multiple threads woven together. A man trying to find his way home. A princess trying to save her people. A planet caught in a struggle for power. And a series of forces, both visible and hidden, pushing everything toward confrontation. That layering is part of what gives the setup its scale. But it's also where things begin to feel complicated. Because the film doesn't just introduce one idea at a time, it introduces many, rapidly. And sometimes without giving each one enough room to fully settle before moving on to the next. You're learning about Carter. You're learning about Barsoom. You're learning about different races, different cities, different technologies, different rules, all at once. And while that creates a sense of scope, it can also create a sense of overload. Because a premise like this needs balance. It needs clarity as much as it needs scale. It needs to guide the audience through the world, not just drop them into it and expect everything to connect instantly. And this is where the setup becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's rich, ambitious, full of potential. On the other hand, it can feel dense, uneven, occasionally difficult to fully grasp in the moment. But even with that complexity, the core idea remains strong. A man out of place, a world in conflict, a journey that begins with escape and slowly transforms into something much bigger. That's the engine driving everything forward. And when it works, when the film focuses on that central dynamic, it taps into something timeless, that sense of discovery, of transformation, of watching someone adapt to a world that challenges everything they thought they understood. But when it drifts, when the setup becomes too scattered, too rushed, too overloaded, it starts to lose that clarity. And that's the balance John Carter is constantly trying to maintain, between simplicity and scale, between a personal journey and a planetary conflict, between a clear narrative path and a world that keeps expanding in every direction. Which leads to the question at the heart of it all: does the premise pull you in because of its ambition, or does it overwhelm you because of how much it tries to carry at once? Because the answer to that question, defines how you experience everything that follows. Some movies tell a story, others build a world and invite you to step inside it. John Carter doesn't just rely on plot to pull you in. Its greatest strength lies in something much bigger, Barsoom. This isn't just Mars as science describes it. This is Mars as imagination recreates it. A planet that feels ancient and futuristic at the same time. A place where advanced technology exists alongside primal traditions. Where towering alien races walk across vast deserts. Where airships glide across the sky. And where entire civilizations rise and fall under a burning red horizon. From the moment Carter arrives, the film makes one thing clear. This is not a backdrop. This is a living world. And that distinction matters. Because good world building doesn't just show you landscapes. It gives you the sense that life was happening here long before the story began and will continue long after it ends. Barsoom feels like that kind of place. It has its own logic, its own rules, its own conflicts. The cities are not just locations. They represent power, culture, identity. The creatures are not just visual effects. They feel like they belong to an ecosystem. The people are not just characters. They are part of something larger than themselves. And visually, it's hard to deny the impact. The deserts stretch endlessly, creating a sense of scale that feels almost mythic. The architecture carries a distinct style, elegant, alien, yet strangely familiar. The skies are filled with movement, ships, creatures, battles unfolding above a world that never feels static. There's detail everywhere. And, more importantly, there's confidence in that detail. Because the film doesn't treat Barsoom like something fragile that needs to be explained every second. It trusts the audience to absorb it, to explore it, to gradually understand how everything fits together. And when that works, it's immersive. You don't feel like you're watching a set. You feel like you're visiting a place. That's especially true with the Tharks, one of the most striking elements of the film's world building. These towering, four-armed beings could have easily felt like generic sci-fi creations, but instead, they become one of the most convincing parts of Barsoom. Their design, their movement, their culture, everything about them suggests that they are not just part of the world. They help define it. They have presence. They feel real. And that's where the film's use of CGI becomes more than just spectacle. Because the goal here isn't just to impress, it's to convince. And for many viewers, it does. The creatures don't just exist visually. They interact, they react, they carry personality. You start to believe in them not as effects, but as inhabitants of this world. That's a huge achievement, especially in a film that depends so heavily on digital creation. Then there's Wula, a character that could have easily been reduced to comic relief, but instead becomes something much more memorable. Wula represents a different side of Barsoom, not just its scale or its danger, but its charm. A reminder that this world isn't only about conflict and spectacle. It has warmth, it has humor, it has moments that feel personal, even within something so massive. And that balance is important, because Barsoom isn't just built to impress you, it's built to engage you. But here's where things get interesting. Because while the world building is often one of the film's greatest strengths, it's also where some of its limitations start to show. Because creating a world is one thing, exploring it is another. And John Carter sometimes struggles with that distinction. It shows you a lot, but it doesn't always take the time to fully develop what it shows. You see different cultures, different systems, different ideas, but you don't always get to understand them deeply. You glimpse the complexity, but you don't always experience it. And that creates a subtle tension, because the world feels big, but not always fully explored. It feels rich, but not always fully realized. You can sense that there's more beneath the surface, but the film doesn't always stay long enough in one place to let that depth fully unfold. And that's where the experience becomes divided. Some viewers are satisfied with what they see. The scale, the imagination, the visual richness. It's enough to make Barsoom feel alive and engaging. Others want more detail, more exploration, more time spent understanding how this world truly works. And that's the trade-off. Because the film chooses momentum over immersion in certain moments. It keeps moving, keeps expanding, keeps introducing new elements, sometimes at the cost of fully grounding the ones already in place. But even with that limitation, the impact of Barsoom is undeniable. It's a world that stays with you, not because you understand every part of it, but because you believe it exists. And that's the real achievement here. Because world building at this scale isn't just about information. It's about presence. It's about creating a place that feels bigger than the story being told inside it. And John Carter does that. Barsoom feels like a world that could hold countless stories, stories we never get to see, but can easily imagine. Which leads to a final thought. What if the greatest strength of John Carter isn't the story it tells, but the world it builds? Because even when the narrative struggles, Barsoom remains expansive, imaginative, and just out of reach of becoming something even greater. One of the most fascinating things about John Carter is that it never settles into just one identity. It doesn't walk into the room and say, I'm a sci-fi film, or I'm a fantasy adventure, or I'm a romance. Instead, it tries to be all of them at the same time. And that decision, that blend, is both one of its biggest strengths and one of its most complicated challenges. Because at its core, John Carter is built like a hybrid. You have science fiction, a man transported to another planet, alien civilizations, advanced technology, strange physics. You have fantasy, ancient cultures, warrior codes, myth-like storytelling, a hero with almost supernatural abilities in a foreign land. You have action-adventure, battles, chases, survival, large-scale conflict. You have romance, a connection forming between two characters from completely different worlds. And layered across all of it, you have something else, an old-fashioned sense of epic storytelling, the kind that doesn't rush to modernize itself, the kind that leans into sincerity, the kind that isn't afraid to be broad, dramatic, and emotionally direct. And when all of those elements align, the film becomes something genuinely engaging. Because genre blending, when done well, creates richness. It allows the movie to move between tones, to offer different kinds of experiences within the same story. One moment, you're watching a high-energy action sequence. The next, you're exploring an alien world. Then suddenly, you're pulled into a character-driven moment or a romantic interaction. That variety can be powerful. It keeps the experience dynamic. It gives different audiences different entry points. And for many viewers, that's exactly what makes John Carter enjoyable. It feels like a complete package. There's something for everyone. Adventure for those who want excitement. Science fiction for those who want imagination. Fantasy for those who want mythology. Romance for those who want emotional connection. It's broad, but intentionally so. But here's the challenge. Because blending genres isn't just about including different elements, it's about balancing them. And that's where John Carter starts to feel uneven. Because while the film contains all these genres, it doesn't always integrate them smoothly. At times, it feels like the movie is shifting rather than blending. You move from one tone to another, but the transitions aren't always seamless. The action can feel disconnected from the emotional core. The romance can feel like it exists alongside the story, rather than growing naturally from it. The science fiction elements can feel underexplored compared to their potential. Instead of forming a single unified experience, the genres sometimes feel like separate layers. And when that happens, the film loses a bit of its cohesion. Because audiences don't just need variety, they need clarity. They need to feel like everything they're watching belongs to the same narrative rhythm. And John Carter doesn't always maintain that rhythm. There are moments where it feels like a thrilling sci-fi adventure. Moments where it leans into fantasy spectacle. Moments where it slows down for romance. Moments where it plays almost like a light, family-friendly comedy. Each of those modes can work on its own, but together they don't always lock into place. And that creates a subtle sense of instability. You're never quite sure what the film wants to be most. Is it primarily an epic adventure? A character-driven romance? A science fiction exploration? A family-friendly spectacle? The answer is all of them. But also, none of them fully. And that ambiguity affects how the film is received. Because for some viewers, that mix is exciting. It makes the movie feel expansive, unpredictable, full of possibility. It gives the experience a kind of cinematic richness that simpler films don't have. But for others, it creates distance. Because without a dominant tone, it becomes harder to emotionally anchor yourself in the story. You're constantly adjusting, shifting expectations, recalibrating how seriously to take each moment, trying to understand what kind of experience the film is ultimately offering. And that's where the genre blend becomes a risk. Because instead of enhancing the story, it can start to dilute it. But here's the key thing to remember. This kind of blending isn't accidental. It reflects the nature of the source material. Stories like John Carter were never meant to fit neatly into one category. They were designed to be expansive, to mix adventure with imagination, to move freely between tones without being confined by modern genre expectations. In that sense, the film is staying true to its roots. It's embracing a style of storytelling that predates the strict genre boundaries we're used to today. And that's why it feels different. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse, but different. Which brings us to the real question: is the genre blend a strength or a weakness? Does it make the film feel richer and more dynamic, or more scattered and unfocused? Because the answer depends entirely on how you experience it. If you're willing to move with the film, to accept its shifts, its changes in tone, its refusal to settle, then the blend becomes part of its charm. But if you're looking for something more defined, more controlled, more consistent, then that same blend can feel like the film never quite finds its center. And that's the balance John Carter never fully resolves. It doesn't commit to one genre because it wants to be many. And in doing so, it creates a movie that is constantly expanding, but not always fully connected. If there's one place where John Carter truly tests its audience, it's not the scale, it's not the world, it's not even the ambition, it's the way the story is built. Because beneath all the spectacle, all the creatures, all the battles and mythology, there's a structure trying to hold everything together, and that structure doesn't always hold. At first, the narrative feels clear enough. A man arrives in a strange world. He wants to go home. He gets pulled into a conflict he never asked for. Simple, clean, easy to follow. But then, the film starts adding layers, more factions, more motivations, more rules, more concepts, and instead of unfolding those ideas step by step, the story begins to stack them, quickly, sometimes too quickly. You're introduced to political tensions, then technological elements, then hidden forces, then new objectives, and before one idea has fully settled, the next one is already in motion. Now, complexity isn't the problem. Complex stories can be incredibly engaging when they're structured with clarity. But John Carter doesn't always guide you through that complexity. Instead, it sometimes expects you to keep up without giving you enough time to fully process what's happening. And that's where the cracks begin to show. Because the film doesn't just struggle with how much it tells, it struggles with how it connects what it tells. Certain plot points feel introduced with importance and then quietly disappear. Certain ideas seem central until the story moves on without resolving them. Certain elements raise questions that are never fully answered, and over time those small gaps start to add up. Not in a way that completely breaks the story, but in a way that makes it feel unstable. Like you're watching something that's constantly shifting, instead of something that's building toward a clear, cohesive direction. One of the most noticeable issues is how the film handles its own setups. It introduces concepts that feel like they should matter later. Powerful elements, mysterious forces, narrative threads that seem essential. But when the time comes to pay those off, they either fade into the background or disappear entirely. And that creates a sense of incompleteness. Because storytelling isn't just about introducing ideas, it's about resolving them. It's about creating a chain where every link connects. But here, some of those links are missing. And when they are, the audience starts to feel it. You begin to ask questions. Wait, what happened to that? Why was that introduced? Was that supposed to matter more? And when those questions don't have clear answers, the story starts to lose its grip. There's also the issue of logical flow. Certain transitions between events feel abrupt. Some decisions feel underexplained. Some character motivations feel assumed rather than developed. Not in a way that makes the film impossible to follow, but in a way that makes it harder to fully believe in. Because coherence isn't just about understanding what's happening, it's about feeling that everything makes sense together. And John Carter doesn't always achieve that. At times, it feels like the film is juggling too many threads at once, without fully committing to weaving them into a single, unified narrative. Instead of building steadily toward a climax, it sometimes feels like it's jumping between ideas, trying to keep everything in motion at the same time. And that affects the ending as well. Because when a story hasn't fully grounded its structure, the conclusion can feel uncertain, like the film is reaching for resolution without having fully earned it. There's a sense that it's wrapping things up, but not necessarily tying everything together. And that's where the phrase comes to mind. It doesn't quite know how to end itself. Now, to be fair, this doesn't make the film unwatchable. The core narrative is still there. You can follow the main journey. You understand the central conflict. But the experience isn't as tight, as focused, or as satisfying as it could have been. Because instead of a story that builds with precision, you get a story that expands with ambition. And those are not the same thing. Ambition gives you scale. Precision gives you clarity. John Carter has plenty of the first, but not always enough of the second, and that's what defines its storytelling. It's not broken, it's not incoherent beyond understanding, but it is uneven. A narrative that starts strong, grows complex, and then struggles to fully bring all its pieces back together. Which leads to a final thought. Is the film's story difficult to follow because it's too complex, or because it wasn't structured clearly enough? Because if the ideas are there, and they are, then the real issue isn't what the story is trying to do, it's how well it manages to connect everything it sets in motion. There's a difference between a movie that moves fast and a movie that flows, and John Carter lives right in that gap. Because on paper, this is a film that should feel relentless. New world, new rules, new conflicts, action, spectacle, movement, constantly pushing forward, and at times, it absolutely does. There are stretches where the film feels energetic, even exhilarating. Scenes unfold with momentum. The action kicks in at the right moments, and the sense of scale carries you forward without resistance. In those moments, the pacing works. It feels purposeful. It feels alive. But then, something shifts. Because pacing isn't just about speed, it's about rhythm. It's about knowing when to move and when to breathe. And that's where John Carter starts to feel uneven. The film doesn't have a single consistent rhythm. Instead, it moves in waves. You'll get a sequence filled with action and energy, and then suddenly, the film slows down. Not in a way that deepens the story, but in a way that stretches it. Scenes linger longer than they need to. Conversations extend without adding new weight. Moments that should build tension instead begin to stall it, and when that happens, you start to feel the runtime. Because this is not a short film. And for a movie built on adventure and spectacle, the expectation is clear. Keep the audience engaged. But engagement isn't just about what's happening, it's about how it's paced. If a scene runs too long, even if it's well-intentioned, it begins to lose impact. If the film slows down at the wrong moment, the momentum fades. If the rhythm isn't controlled, the experience becomes inconsistent. And that inconsistency is what defines the pacing here. For some viewers, the film feels intense, packed with events, constantly moving, never dull. For others, it feels the opposite, slow, dragging, even tedious at times. And what's fascinating is that both reactions can come from the same film, because John Carter doesn't fail at pacing in a simple way, it fluctuates. There are parts where the film is doing too much, too quickly, introducing ideas, characters, conflicts in rapid succession, and then there are parts where it does too little, for too long, holding on to scenes that don't justify their length. That imbalance creates a strange experience. You're either catching up or waiting, rarely sitting comfortably in the middle. And that affects how the story feels overall. Because when pacing is controlled, the audience feels guided. They feel carried through the narrative. But when pacing is uneven, the audience becomes aware of the structure itself. You start noticing the length of scenes. You start checking how much time has passed. You start feeling the weight of the runtime instead of being absorbed by it. And that's where John Carter struggles most. Not in its ability to create exciting moments, but in its ability to connect those moments with consistent rhythm. There's also a deeper issue tied to this, because pacing is closely linked to storytelling clarity. When a film introduces too much too quickly, it risks overwhelming the audience. When it slows down without adding depth, it risks losing their attention. And John Carter does both. It rushes through important information early on, and then lingers on less impactful material later. That imbalance breaks the natural flow. Instead of building steadily, the film expands and contracts unpredictably. And when that happens, the runtime starts to feel longer than it actually is, because time in cinema isn't measured by minutes, it's measured by engagement. A 2-hour film can feel like 1 hour if the rhythm is right, and it can feel like 3 if it isn't. John Carter sits somewhere in between. For some, it flies by. For others, it drags. And that divide comes down to one thing, whether the rhythm works for you or not. Because when it does, the film feels like an epic journey, full, expansive, and worth the time. But when it doesn't, it feels like a story that keeps losing its momentum and struggling to regain it. Which leads to the real question: is the pacing of John Carter inconsistent because it's trying to do too much, or because it doesn't know how to balance what it already has? Because the answer to that question determines everything. Whether you experience the film as intense and immersive or long and uneven depends entirely on how that rhythm lands with you. If world building gives John Carter its scale and action gives it its energy, then the script is what's supposed to hold everything together. And this is where the film becomes the most divided. Because the writing in John Carter isn't consistently bad, but it's also not consistently strong. It exists in that middle space, where you can see flashes of something sharp, engaging, even intelligent, and then suddenly, it slips into something awkward, stiff, or overly forced. That inconsistency defines the entire experience. There are moments where the dialogue works, where it carries the tone of adventure, where it feels natural within the world, where characters sound like they belong in the story they're telling. And in those moments, the film feels confident, the exposition blends into the narrative, the humor lands. The interactions feel believable enough to keep you invested. But those moments don't last, because just as often, the dialogue starts to feel unnatural, not in a subtle way, in a way that pulls you out of the scene. Lines become overly formal, conversations stretch beyond their purpose. Exposition becomes too obvious, too direct, too heavy. Instead of revealing information organically, the script begins to explain. And when a movie starts explaining too much, you can feel it. The dialogue stops sounding like conversation and starts sounding like instruction, like characters are speaking for the audience instead of speaking to each other. That's where the writing begins to lose its grip. Because good dialogue doesn't just deliver information, it carries emotion, subtext, personality. It makes characters feel real. But in John Carter, that layer isn't always present. Characters often say exactly what they mean, instead of letting meaning emerge naturally, and that makes interactions feel flatter than they should, especially in scenes that are meant to carry emotional weight. Take the romantic exchanges, for example. These are moments that should feel personal, intimate, evolving, but instead, they often feel structured, almost mechanical. Like the dialogue is trying to convince you that something meaningful is happening, instead of allowing you to feel it on your own. And when that happens, the connection weakens. Not because the idea of the relationship doesn't work, but because the writing doesn't fully support it. The same issue appears in the film's more serious moments. When characters are meant to express urgency, conflict, or inner struggle, the dialogue sometimes leans too heavily into formality or repetition. Instead of sharpening the tension, it slows it down. Instead of deepening the moment, it distances it. And over time, that creates a pattern. A pattern where the script feels like it's working hard, but not always working effectively. That's what makes it frustrating, because the potential is clearly there. You can see glimpses of a more refined version of this script, one where the dialogue is tighter, sharper, more emotionally grounded. But those glimpses are inconsistent. They appear, and then they disappear, leaving you with the film that never fully settles into a confident voice. There's also the issue of tone within the dialogue. Because John Carter is blending multiple genres, adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, romance, the script has to constantly adjust its language, and it doesn't always manage that smoothly. Some lines feel grounded and natural. Others feel overly theatrical. Others feel modern in a way that clashes with the setting. That tonal inconsistency adds to the unevenness, because dialogue is one of the main ways a film establishes identity, and when that identity keeps shifting, the audience starts to feel it. You're not always sure how seriously to take what's being said, and that uncertainty affects immersion. Now, to be fair, this isn't a script without merit. There are moments of wit, moments of clarity, moments where the writing supports the film's sense of adventure and scale. But those moments aren't sustained, and that's the key issue, because consistency is what elevates a script. Not isolated good lines, but a continuous sense of control over how the story is told. And John Carter doesn't always have that control. It feels like a script that knows what it wants to achieve, but doesn't always know how to express it in the most effective way. Which leads to a final question. Is the dialogue in John Carter ineffective because it's poorly written, or because it's trying to carry too much of the film's weight? Because when a story relies heavily on its dialogue to explain, connect, and justify everything happening, any weakness in that writing becomes impossible to ignore. And in a film this ambitious, the script needed to be the strongest foundation of all. A story can have scale, it can have spectacle, it can have an entire world built from imagination. But without characters you feel, none of it truly lands. And this is where John Carter faces one of its most consistent challenges. Because for all its ambition, all its visual power, all its world building, the emotional core never fully takes hold the way it should. On the surface, the ingredients are all there. You have a protagonist with a past, a man shaped by war, loss, and disillusionment. Someone who begins the story detached, unwilling to fight, unwilling to care, unwilling to get involved. That's a strong starting point, because it sets up a clear emotional arc, a man who wants nothing to do with conflict, forced into a situation where he has to choose whether to stand for something again. That's powerful. That's the kind of journey that can carry an entire film. But the problem isn't the idea. The problem is the execution. Because while the film gives John Carter a backstory, it doesn't always build on it. We're told who he is. We understand what he's been through. But we don't always feel how those experiences shape his decisions moment to moment. His transformation, from reluctant outsider to active participant, happens, but not always with the emotional depth it needs to truly resonate. It feels like a shift that occurs because the story requires it, not because we fully experienced it with him. And that's the key difference. Because character development isn't just about change, it's about earned change. It's about seeing the steps, feeling the conflict, understanding why a character evolves the way they do. And in John Carter, those steps are sometimes rushed or simply not explored enough. The same applies to the supporting characters. There are a lot of them, different factions, different personalities, different roles within the larger conflict, but many of them feel underdeveloped. Not because they're poorly conceived, but because they're not given enough time or focus to fully come to life. You understand their function in the story. You know what side they're on. You know what they're trying to achieve. But you don't always know them. Not in a way that creates a strong emotional connection. They exist to move the narrative forward rather than to deepen it. And that becomes especially noticeable in a film like this. Because the world is so large, the stakes are so high. When everything around the characters is expansive, the characters themselves need to feel grounded. They need to be the anchor. But here, that anchor isn't always strong enough. There are moments where it almost works, where a character shows a glimpse of depth, where an interaction hints at something more meaningful, where you start to feel a connection forming. But those moments are not sustained. They appear, and then the film moves on. Back to the plot. Back to the action. Back to the next big event. And in doing so, it misses the opportunity to fully develop those emotional threads. That's what creates the distance. Because emotional weight doesn't come from scale, it comes from investment. It comes from caring about what happens to these characters, not just understanding what's happening around them. And John Carter doesn't always bridge that gap. You follow the story, you understand the stakes, you see the conflict, but you don't always feel it. At least not as deeply as the film seems to want you to. And that becomes most noticeable in the film's key relationships, especially the central dynamic between Carter and the people he encounters on Barsoom. These relationships are meant to drive the story forward, to give Carter a reason to stay, to fight, to change. But because they're not fully developed, their impact feels limited. You can see what the film is aiming for. You can see the emotional beats it wants to hit. But those beats don't always land with the weight they need, because they haven't been fully built. And that leads to a very specific kind of experience. You're watching something that should feel powerful but doesn't quite reach that level. Not because it's empty, but because it's underdeveloped. Because the foundation is there, but the structure isn't fully realized. And that's what makes this aspect of the film so frustrating. Because it's not a case of missing potential, it's a case of unfulfilled potential. You can see the stronger version of these characters. You can imagine the deeper connections, the more meaningful arcs, the more impactful emotional moments. But the film doesn't stay with them long enough to make those possibilities real. Which brings us to the central question: does John Carter struggle emotionally because the characters aren't interesting, or because the film doesn't give them enough space to become interesting? Because if the potential is there, and it clearly is, then the issue isn't who these characters are. It's how fully we're allowed to experience them. And in a story this big, that difference matters more than anything else. In a story this large, with worlds colliding, wars unfolding, and entire civilizations at stake, you still need something smaller, something human, something that grounds everything else. That's where the romance in John Carter is supposed to come in. Because at its core, the relationship between John Carter and Dejah Thoris isn't just a side element, it's meant to be one of the emotional pillars of the entire story. It's the bridge between two worlds, a man from Earth and a princess from Barsoom, different origins, different values, different realities, and yet brought together by circumstance, conflict, and shared purpose. On paper, it's exactly the kind of dynamic that should work. It has contrast, it has tension, it has the potential for growth. It's the kind of relationship that can evolve naturally as the story unfolds, starting with distance, moving toward understanding, and eventually becoming something deeper. But in execution, this is where the film becomes one of its most divided. Because for some viewers, the romance fits. It aligns with the film's old-fashioned, adventurous tone. It adds a layer of emotional connection. It gives Carter a reason to stay, to care, to become more than just an outsider trying to get home. In that reading, the romance works as part of the film's larger identity, a classic adventure story where connection grows alongside conflict. But for others, it's one of the weakest elements in the entire film. And the reason comes down to one thing: it doesn't feel fully earned. Because romance and storytelling isn't just about pairing two characters together. It's about building that connection. It's about giving the audience time to see how these two people influence each other, how they challenge each other, how they change because of each other. And that process takes time. It takes subtlety. It takes progression. But John Carter often moves too quickly. The relationship shifts before it fully develops. Moments that should deepen the connection feel rushed or underexplored. Conversations that should carry emotional weight sometimes feel structured rather than natural. Instead of watching a relationship grow, it can feel like you're watching it form by necessity, as if the story requires it to happen, so it happens. And when that happens, something important is lost. Because the audience doesn't just need to understand the relationship. They need to believe in it. They need to feel it. And that's where the film struggles. The chemistry between Carter and Dejah Thoris is there in moments, glimpses of something that could have been compelling, even powerful. But those moments aren't consistently supported by the writing. The dialogue doesn't always help. The pacing doesn't always give the relationship room to breathe. The story keeps moving, sometimes before the emotional foundation has been fully built, and as a result, the romance feels uneven. Not completely ineffective, but not fully convincing either. It exists, it functions, but it doesn't always resonate, and that becomes especially noticeable because of how important it is to the story. This relationship isn't just a subplot, it's tied directly to Carter's transformation, his decisions, his motivations, his shift from wanting to leave to choosing to stay. When the romance works, it strengthens that arc. It gives his journey emotional weight. But when it doesn't, that arc feels less grounded, less personal, more driven by circumstance than by genuine connection. And that's the core issue. Not that the romance is unnecessary, but that it isn't fully realized. Because the idea is strong. A man finding connection in a world that isn't his own. A relationship forming across boundaries of culture, identity, and experience. That's powerful. But the execution doesn't always match the potential, and so the romance becomes something that divides the audience. Some will accept it as part of the film's broader adventure tone, a classic, straightforward connection that fits the style. Others will see it as rushed, unconvincing, even distracting from the story rather than enhancing it. Both perspectives come from the same place, the sense that something important was there, but not fully developed. Which leads to the final question. Is the romance in John Carter effective because it fits the story's tone, or ineffective because it never fully earns its place within it? Because in a film built on scale and spectacle, it's often the smallest, most personal connections that determine whether the story truly stays with you. In a film this large, with worlds, creatures, and spectacle constantly competing for attention, the cast has one critical job: make it feel human. Because no matter how impressive the visuals are, no matter how expansive the world becomes, it's the performances that determine whether you connect to any of it. And in John Carter, the casting is interesting, not weak, not extraordinary, but somewhere in between, in that space where effort is visible, but impact varies. Let's start with the center of it all, John Carter himself, played by Kitsch. This is a role that carries a lot of weight. He's not just the protagonist. He's the audience's entry point into an entirely unfamiliar world. Every reaction, every decision, every shift in perspective has to feel believable through him, and Kitsch's performance reflects that pressure. At times, he feels slightly restrained, a little too serious, a little too rigid, like he's still settling into the role. The emotional range doesn't always come through as strongly as it could, but as the film progresses, something changes. He relaxes. The character becomes more natural, more approachable, more aligned with the tone of the story. And in those moments, he works. Not in a way that completely elevates the film, but in a way that stabilizes it. He becomes a likable presence, a capable center, someone you can follow, even if you're not fully invested. Then there's Deja Thoris, played by Lynn, and here the response becomes more divided. On one hand, she brings strength, confidence, determination, a sense that this character is more than just a traditional figure in a fantasy setting. She has presence, but on the other hand, that presence isn't always supported by the writing. At times, the performance feels constrained by the material, like it's aiming for something deeper, but doesn't have enough space to fully express it, and that creates a disconnect. Because you can see what the character could be, but you don't always get to experience it fully. Now, where the film becomes more interesting is in the supporting cast, because this is where John Carter quietly builds strength. You have actors like Willem Dafoe, Mark Strong, Ciarán Hinds, Dominic West, and Bryan Cranston. This is not a weak lineup. These are performers with presence, experience, and range, and you can feel that. Even when the script doesn't give them much to work with, they try to bring something to their roles. A sense of authority, a hint of personality, moments that stand out, even if briefly. But here's the problem. They're underused. The film surrounds itself with strong actors, but doesn't always give them enough space to fully contribute. It's like having all the right pieces, but not arranging them in a way that maximizes their potential. You catch glimpses of what these performances could have been, especially in characters like Tharks, where voice and motion capture combine to create something more layered. But those glimpses are inconsistent. They don't always build into something sustained. And that's the recurring theme with the performances in this film. Not failure, but limitation. Because the cast isn't the issue. The ability is there. The presence is there. What's missing is the support. The script doesn't always give the actors enough depth. The pacing doesn't always give them enough time. The narrative doesn't always prioritize their development. So instead of fully realized performances, you get partial ones, moments of strength, moments of engagement, but not a continuous emotional thread that carries through the entire film. And that affects the overall experience. Because performances are what connect the audience to the story, they turn events into emotions, they turn conflict into something personal, and when those performances aren't fully developed, that connection weakens, not completely, but noticeably. There's also the question of casting itself. Does everyone fit their role? For some viewers, the answer is yes. The casting feels appropriate, aligned with the characters, consistent with the tone of the film. For others, it feels less convincing. Certain performances don't fully match the depth or complexity expected from the characters, and that divide once again reflects the film as a whole. It's not a clear success, but it's not a clear failure either. It's a mix, and that mix creates an uneven experience. Because when everything aligns, when the actor, the character, and the moment come together, the film feels grounded, it feels real. But when that alignment isn't there, the performance fades into the background. And in a film this ambitious, that matters. Because with so much happening on screen, you need strong performances to anchor everything. Without that anchor, the spectacle can start to feel distant. Which brings us to the final question. Are the performances in John Carter limited because of the actors, or because the film never gives them the chance to fully shine? Because if the talent is there, and it clearly is, then the difference between a good performance and a great one comes down to how much the film allows it to grow. In a film as expansive as John Carter, it's easy to assume that everything depends on the hero. But sometimes it's the characters around him, the unexpected ones, the strange ones, the non-human ones, that leave the strongest impression. And in this film, that's exactly what happens. Because while the central characters carry the narrative, it's the supporting figures, especially the creatures, that give the world its personality. Let's start with the Tharks. These towering four-armed beings are not just part of the background. They are essential to the identity of Barsoom. And what's remarkable is how quickly they become believable. Not just visually, but as characters. They have structure, they have culture, they have a sense of presence that goes beyond design. You're not just looking at them, you're watching them exist. And that's where the performance of Willem Dafoe as Tharks becomes so important. Because even through motion capture, there's weight in the character. A sense of authority, of conflict, of something deeper beneath the surface. He's not just an alien leader. He feels like someone shaped by the world he lives in, and that's the difference between a creature and a character. But as strong as the Tharks are, there's one figure that stands out in a completely different way. Woola. A strange, fast-moving, loyal creature that shouldn't work as well as it does. On paper, Woola could have easily been reduced to a gimmick, a simple comic relief edition designed to appeal to audiences. But in execution, he becomes one of the most memorable parts of the entire film. Because Woola isn't just funny, he's engaging. There's personality in the movement, there's emotion in the reactions, there's a sense that this creature isn't just there to entertain, it's there to connect. And that connection matters. Because in a film filled with complex ideas, layered conflicts, and large-scale storytelling, Woola brings something simple, something immediate, something human, even though he's not human at all. And that contrast makes him stand out even more. But here's where things get interesting. Because while some supporting characters leave a strong impression, others don't, and that's where the inconsistency begins to show again. There are plenty of secondary characters in this world. Different factions, different leaders, different personalities. But not all of them are given the same level of attention. Some feel distinct, memorable, even in limited screen time. Others feel interchangeable, not because they lack potential, but because they're not fully developed. They exist to serve the plot, to move the story forward, to fill the world. But they don't always rise beyond that function. And in a world this rich, that becomes noticeable. Because when the environment is so detailed, so imaginative, so alive, you expect the characters within it to match that level of depth. When they don't, there's a disconnect. The world feels full, but the characters don't always. That's why the creatures often stand out more. Because they're designed with such clarity, such purpose, such presence, that they naturally draw attention. They feel complete, even when the human characters around them don't. And that creates a unique dynamic, where the emotional highlights of the film don't always come from the main cast, but from the supporting elements, from the unexpected places, from the creatures that bring life to the world in ways the script doesn't always allow the characters to do. But again, this is not a complete imbalance. It's a partial one, because there are supporting performances that work, moments where actors bring something memorable, even with limited material. But those moments are scattered. They don't always build into a consistent supporting ensemble that strengthens the entire film. And that's the key issue, because in a story this large, the supporting cast isn't optional. They're essential. They're what make the world feel populated, believable, dynamic. And while John Carter succeeds in creating that sense visually, it doesn't always achieve it narratively. Which brings us to the core question. Why do the creatures feel more alive than some of the characters? Is it because they're better designed, or because the film invests more care into how they're presented? Because when a creature like Woola becomes one of the most memorable elements of the film, it says something important. Not just about the strength of the visual design, but about where the film's emotional connection is truly coming from. And in John Carter, that connection often comes from the places you least expect. In a film like John Carter, where entire worlds are imagined, where creatures don't exist in reality, where physics itself behaves differently, there is no safety net. If the visual effects don't work, nothing works. Because this isn't a story you can fake with suggestion. This is a story that demands you believe what you're seeing, and this is where John Carter makes one of its strongest arguments. Because whatever you think about the story, whatever issues you have with the pacing or the script, the visual effects are hard to dismiss. They are confident. Not flashy for the sake of being flashy, but constructed with a level of detail that gives the world weight. The creatures move with intention. The environments feel layered. The interactions between real actors and digital elements don't feel disconnected. And that's important, because CGI doesn't succeed just by looking good in isolation. It succeeds when it feels integrated. When it feels like everything you're seeing belongs in the same space. and John Carter achieves that more often than not. The Tharks, for example, are a perfect demonstration of this. They're large, complex, entirely digital creations, and yet they feel grounded. They don't float. They don't slide through the frame. They don't feel like overlays. They have presence. You can sense their weight. Their movement has resistance. Their interactions with the environment feel natural, and that's what sells the illusion, not perfection, but believability. The same applies to the broader world of Barsoom. This isn't a flat, empty digital landscape. It's textured. The deserts aren't just backgrounds. They have depth. The cities aren't just structures. They feel inhabited. The skies aren't static. They're alive with motion. There's a consistency to the design, a sense that everything has been built within the same visual language, and that consistency is what keeps the illusion intact. Because once the audience starts noticing the seams, the experience breaks. But here, those seams are mostly hidden. You're not constantly reminded that you're watching effects. You're allowed to stay inside the world. That's a major achievement, especially for a film that relies so heavily on digital creation. Now, that doesn't mean everything is flawless. There are moments where the effects feel more noticeable, moments where the blend isn't perfect, moments where the scale or movement feels slightly off. But those moments are exceptions, not the rule, and in a film of this size, that matters, because consistency is more important than perfection. If the majority of the film maintains its illusion, the audience stays engaged, and John Carter largely succeeds in that. Another important aspect is how the CGI supports character, because it's not just about environments and spectacle, it's about performance. Characters like Tharks don't just exist visually, they emote, they react, they carry personality. And that's where the technology becomes storytelling, because when a digital character can convey emotion, it stops being an effect, it becomes part of the narrative. That's a level of execution not every film reaches, and John Carter gets closer to it than many people give it credit for. There's also something to be said about restraint, because the film doesn't rely on gimmicks. It doesn't constantly push effects toward the camera just to prove they're there. It doesn't overload every scene with unnecessary spectacle. Instead, it uses its visual tools to support the story, even when the story itself struggles. And that's an important distinction, because great visual effects don't exist to distract, they exist to immerse. And when they're working, you stop thinking about how they were made. You just accept what you're seeing. That's the goal. And for much of John Carter, that goal is achieved, which leads to an interesting realization. Because for a film that was heavily criticized, the visual effects are rarely the problem. In fact, they're often one of the reasons people continue to defend it. They're part of what makes the film watchable, even when other elements fall short. They're part of what makes Barsoom feel real, even when the narrative feels uneven. And they're part of what hints at the film's true potential. Because when you see what's been achieved visually, you can't help but imagine what it could have been like if everything else had reached the same level. Which brings us to the final question. Are the visual effects in John Carter impressive because of their scale, or because they succeed in making an impossible world feel believable? Because if it's the second, and it often is, then this isn't just technical achievement. It's world building through visual storytelling. And in a film like this, that might be the most important effect of all. If visual effects build the illusion, then production design gives that illusion its identity. It's the difference between a world that looks impressive and a world that feels designed. And in John Carter, that design is everywhere. From the moment you step onto Barsoom, there's a clear sense that this isn't a randomly assembled environment. This is a world shaped by intention, by architecture, by culture, by history. The cities don't just exist for spectacle, they carry a visual language. The structures feel artistic, almost ceremonial, reflecting a civilization that values form as much as function. There's a kind of elegance to it. Not polished in a modern way, but stylized in a way that feels ancient and advanced at the same time. And that contrast is important, because Barsoom isn't supposed to feel like Earth. It's supposed to feel familiar enough to understand, but different enough to remain intriguing. And the production design achieves that. The landscapes stretch with purpose. The interiors feel lived in. The technology blends into the environment rather than clashing with it. Everything seems to belong. That's what strong design does. It removes the sense of artificial construction and replaces it with cohesion. You're not thinking about how the world was built, you're simply experiencing it. But then, we get to the costumes. and this is where the conversation becomes more divided. Because while the environments feel carefully crafted, the costume design doesn't always carry the same level of consistency. There are moments where it works, where the clothing reflects the world, the culture, the identity of the characters. But there are also moments where it feels disconnected, simplified, less detailed, sometimes even out of place compared to the richness of the environments. And that creates a subtle imbalance. Because when the world around the characters feels so detailed, you expect the characters themselves to match that level of design. When they don't, it becomes noticeable. You start to see the contrast, a beautifully realized world populated by characters who don't always visually belong to it. That doesn't break the film, but it weakens the illusion, because production design isn't just about environments, it's about everything within those environments working together. And when one element feels less developed, the overall presentation loses some of its cohesion. There's also the question of tone, because visual presentation isn't just about how things look, it's about how those visuals support the story. And John Carter exists in a space between styles. It wants to feel epic, but also accessible. It wants to feel alien, but also familiar. It wants to feel grand, but still grounded enough for audiences to connect with. That balance is difficult to maintain, and sometimes the visual choices reflect that struggle. Certain elements lean more towards spectacle, while others feel simplified, almost understated, and that inconsistency carries through the presentation. You can see moments of brilliance, shots that feel expansive, detailed, cinematic, and then you can see moments that feel less refined, less aligned with the world the film is trying to build. But even with that inconsistency, the overall impression remains strong. Because when John Carter works visually, it works on a large scale. The combination of design, effects, and setting creates images that stay with you, not because they're perfect, but because they feel intentional. There's a sense that this world wasn't just imagined, it was constructed, piece by piece, layer by layer, and that effort shows. Which leads to an important realization. The film doesn't fail visually, it fluctuates, it reaches high points and then dips. It creates moments of full immersion, and then moments where that immersion slightly breaks. And that's consistent with everything else in the film. Strong ideas, strong execution in parts, but not always sustained at the same level. Which brings us to the final question. Does the visual presentation of John Carter succeed because of its ambition, or does it fall short because it isn't consistently refined? Because if the world feels real, even when parts of it don't fully align, then maybe the achievement isn't perfection. Maybe it's the fact that, despite its inconsistencies, Barsoom still feels like a place you visited. In a film like John Carter, action isn't just decoration, it's the engine. It's what keeps the world moving, what translates scale into experience, what turns imagination into something you can feel. And when this film leans into its action, it comes alive. Because the action in John Carter isn't just about noise and chaos. It has identity, it has movement, and most importantly, it has a physical language that makes it stand out. That language comes from one key idea. Carter doesn't move like everyone else. On Barsoom, the rules of gravity are different, which means Carter becomes something more than human. Faster, stronger, able to leap across massive distances, and that changes everything. Because now, every fight, every chase, every moment of conflict feels slightly elevated, literally and visually. This isn't grounded combat, it's dynamic, elastic, almost weightless in the way it flows. And when the film uses that properly, the action becomes genuinely exciting. You're not just watching characters collide, you're watching a system of movement that feels unique to this world. That's where the film finds its rhythm. Swordplay that feels fluid instead of rigid. Battles that feel staged with intention, not just scale. Moments where Carter's physical advantage isn't just a gimmick, it's integrated into how the action unfolds. And then there are the set pieces. Because John Carter doesn't think small, it builds sequences around spectacle, arena battles, massive creature encounters, airship combat, large-scale clashes between factions. These aren't quick moments, they're designed to be experiences, and visually, they often deliver. The gladiator-style sequence in particular stands out as one of the film's strongest displays of controlled chaos. It's not just about what's happening, it's about how clearly it's presented. You can follow the movement, you can understand the stakes, you can feel the scale without losing orientation. That clarity matters, because action doesn't impress just by being big, it impresses by being readable. And for the most part, John Carter understands that. It avoids becoming a blur of motion, it gives space for choreography to register. It allows the audience to stay inside the sequence instead of being overwhelmed by it. But here's where things become divided again. Because while many of the action sequences are praised, not everyone experiences them the same way. For some viewers, the action is a highlight, energetic, visually engaging, and consistent enough to carry the film through its weaker moments. For others, it's not enough. There's a sense that despite the scale, there aren't enough of these sequences, that the film spends too much time building toward action and not enough time delivering it. And when the action does arrive, some feel it doesn't always reach the intensity it promises. That's the split. Because the action itself isn't necessarily flawed, but its placement and frequency affect how it's perceived. If you're fully engaged in the world, the set pieces feel rewarding. If you're waiting for the film to find its momentum, they can feel too spaced out to maintain that engagement. And that ties directly into pacing. Because action isn't just about execution, it's about timing. When it comes at the right moment, it elevates the story. When it comes too late or too infrequently, it struggles to carry the weight it's given. Still, even with that inconsistency, there's something important to recognize. The action in John Carter is not generic. It's not interchangeable with every other blockbuster. It has a style, a rhythm, a sense of movement that belongs specifically to this world, and that's not something every film achieves. Because creating action that feels distinct, not just louder or bigger, but different, requires more than budget. It requires design. And John Carter has that. It just doesn't always sustain it. Which brings us to the final question. Is the action in John Carter effective because of how it's executed, or limited because of how it's distributed throughout the film? Because when it works, it's one of the strongest elements of the entire experience. But when it's absent, you start to feel exactly how much the film depends on it. And that balance between spectacle and structure is what ultimately defines how these set pieces land. Not just as moments, but as the force that keeps the story in motion. In a film this large, where worlds are built, battles unfold, and emotions are meant to carry across an entire planet, sound isn't just support, it's power. It's what tells you how to feel before the story even asks you to. And in John Carter, the music and sound design become one of the most fascinating contradictions in the entire film. Because depending on who you ask, this is either one of its greatest strengths or one of its most noticeable weaknesses. Let's start with the score. Composed by Michael Giacchino, the music is designed to match the scale of the story. It's bold, it's sweeping, it carries that sense of classic adventure, the kind of orchestral energy that feels larger than the moment itself. And when it works beautifully. The music lifts the action. It amplifies the emotion. It gives the world a sense of grandeur that the visuals alone can't fully achieve. You feel the momentum in the score. You feel the weight of the journey. There's a confidence to it, a willingness to be big, to be expressive, to lean into the epic nature of the story without holding back. In those moments, the film feels elevated, not just visually impressive, but emotionally charged. But here's where the divide begins. Because not everyone experiences the score that way. For some, the music doesn't enhance the film. It overwhelms it. It becomes too present, too insistent, too detached from the emotional rhythm of the scenes. Instead of blending seamlessly into the narrative, it starts to feel like it's pushing the emotion rather than supporting it. And when that happens, the impact shifts, because a great score should feel invisible in its effectiveness. You shouldn't notice it as a separate element, you should feel it as part of the story. But when the balance is off, you become aware of it. You start hearing the music instead of feeling it. And that awareness breaks immersion. Then there's the sound design. And this is where the criticism becomes more direct. Because while the visuals are often praised for their detail and consistency, the sound doesn't always reach that same level. Certain moments lack depth. Effects don't always carry the weight you expect from a world this large. The layering of sound, the way different elements come together, can feel uneven. In a film filled with massive creatures, large-scale battles, and complex environments, sound should play a critical role in grounding everything. It should give texture to the world. It should make movement feel real. It should make scale feel tangible. But in John Carter, that grounding isn't always there. At times, the sound feels thinner than the visuals suggest, and that creates a disconnect. Because when you see something powerful but don't hear it with the same intensity, the illusion weakens. The world looks real, but doesn't always sound real. And that's a subtle but important issue, because sound is one of the main ways we experience presence. It's what makes a world feel alive beyond what we can see. And when it doesn't fully deliver, the experience becomes less immersive. Still, this isn't a complete failure. There are moments where the sound and music come together effectively, where the score supports the action, where the effects align with the visuals, where everything feels synchronized. But those moments are not consistent. And once again, that word comes back: inconsistency. It's not that the music is always great or always weak. It's not that the sound design completely fails or completely succeeds. It fluctuates: high points and low points, moments of impact and moments of absence. And in a film built on scale, that fluctuation becomes more noticeable, because the expectation is higher. When everything looks this big, everything should sound just as big. Which leads to the final question: is the music in John Carter powerful because it embraces the film's epic tone, or distracting because it doesn't always align with the story's rhythm? And is the sound design effective enough to support the world being built, or does it fall short of matching the visual ambition? Because in a film like this, sound isn't just an addition, it's part of the illusion. And when that illusion is fully aligned, you don't just watch the world, you hear it come alive. When a filmmaker moves from one medium to another, the question isn't just, can they do it? It's, what changes? Because directing animation and directing live action are not the same craft. One is built frame by frame, controlled down to the smallest detail. The other is shaped in real time, through actors, environments, unpredictability. And John Carter sits right at that intersection, because at the center of it is Andrew Stanton, a director known for creating some of the most emotionally resonant animated films of his time. Films that were precise, controlled, carefully structured. So when he stepped into live action with John Carter, it wasn't just a new project. It was a transition. And that transition is felt throughout the film. On one hand, you can see his strengths immediately. There's a sense of vision here, a willingness to build something expansive, to embrace scale without losing sight of imagination, to create a world that feels designed, not just assembled. The visual storytelling, especially in how Barsoom is presented, carries that animated sensibility. Every frame feels intentional. Every environment feels considered. There's clarity in how the world is constructed. And when the film leans into that, it works. It feels energetic. It feels adventurous. It feels like a director who understands how to guide the audience through a visually complex space. There's also a sense of sincerity, a lack of cynicism. The film doesn't feel like it's trying to outsmart the audience or deconstruct its own genre. It plays things straight. It believes in its world. It believes in its characters. And that kind of confidence, that willingness to tell a story without irony, is something Stanton brings with him from animation. But then, you start to see the other side of the transition. Because live action demands something different. It demands control over performance, over pacing, over tone in a way that's less constructed and more organic. And this is where the film becomes uneven. Because while the world feels cohesive, the storytelling doesn't always follow that same level of control. Scenes don't always flow as smoothly as they should. Character interactions don't always feel fully grounded. The emotional beats don't always land with the precision you'd expect. It's as if the film knows what it wants to show, but isn't always sure how to guide the audience through it. And that's a key difference between mediums. In animation, every moment is built deliberately. Nothing exists unless it's placed there with intention. In live action, you're working with variables. Actors bring their own energy. Scenes evolve differently. Timing becomes more fluid. And if that fluidity isn't fully controlled, the result can feel inconsistent. That's what happens here. Not in a way that completely breaks the film, but in a way that reveals the adjustment. There are moments where Stanton feels completely in command, where the film moves with clarity and purpose, and then there are moments where it feels like that control slips, where the pacing falters, where the tone shifts, where the connection between scenes weakens. And that creates a kind of imbalance, because the direction is not lacking vision, it's lacking consistency. It's the work of a director who clearly understands storytelling, but is still adapting to a new form of it. There's also the scale to consider. This is not a small film. This is a massive production. large cast, heavy effects, complex world building. And managing that kind of scale in live action is a challenge in itself. For a director stepping into this medium for the first time, that challenge becomes even greater. And to Stanton's credit, he doesn't shy away from it. He embraces it. He takes on the full weight of the project. But that ambition comes with risk. Because when you aim this high, every inconsistency becomes more visible. Every weakness stands out against the scale of what you're trying to achieve. And that's exactly what happens in John Carter. You can see the talent, you can see the intent, you can see the effort to bring something expansive and imaginative to life, but you can also see the growing pains. The moments where the transition from animation to live action isn't fully seamless. The moments where the film feels like it's still finding its rhythm. And that's what makes this direction so interesting, because it's not a failure, and it's not a complete success either. It's a transition captured on screen. A director stepping into a new space, bringing strengths with him, while still adapting to the demands of that space. Which leads to the final question. Does John Carter succeed because of Andrew Stanton's vision, or struggle because of the challenges of translating that vision into live action? Because if the foundation is strong, and it clearly is, then the difference between what the film is and what it could have been might come down to this moment of transition. A director with imagination, learning how to fully control a new world while trying to build one at the same time. Before you judge John Carter, you have to answer one simple question. What kind of movie is this trying to be? Because everything about your experience depends on that answer. This is not a dark, grounded science fiction film. It's not trying to dissect its world with realism or complexity. And it's not a modern, self-aware blockbuster filled with irony and commentary. Instead, John Carter chooses something very different. It leans into sincerity. An old-fashioned, almost forgotten style of storytelling, where adventure is taken seriously, even when the world itself is fantastical. This is a film that believes in its own story. It doesn't wink at the audience. It doesn't apologize for its ideas. It doesn't try to distance itself from its own scale. It commits to the hero, to the world, to the journey, and that commitment defines its tone. Because John Carter isn't trying to reinvent the genre, it's trying to embrace it. It's a throwback to a style of storytelling where the hero is larger than life. The world is vast and imaginative. The stakes are high, but the experience is meant to be fun. There's an innocence to it. Not naive, but earnest. And for some viewers, that's exactly what makes it work. Because in a cinematic landscape filled with complexity, cynicism, and constant reinvention, John Carter feels refreshingly straightforward. It's not trying to be clever, it's trying to be engaging. It wants you to sit back, step into another world, and enjoy the ride. And when you approach it that way, the tone clicks. The action feels exciting. The humor feels light. The romance feels appropriate within the context. The world feels like something you're meant to explore, not analyze. It becomes what it was always intended to be, a family-friendly adventure. A film that doesn't demand intellectual dissection, but rewards emotional openness. But here's where the divide begins. Because not everyone comes into this film with that expectation. Some viewers expect something deeper, more grounded, more complex, more aligned with modern storytelling standards, and when they don't get that, the tone starts to feel off. What was meant to be earnest feels simplistic. What was meant to be adventurous feels generic. What was meant to be fun feels lacking in depth. And that shift in expectation changes everything. Because tone isn't just what the film presents, it's how the audience receives it. If you expect a layered, intricate narrative, the film's straightforward approach may feel underwhelming. If you expect a serious, grounded sci-fi experience, the fantasy elements may feel too exaggerated. But if you understand what the film is aiming for, those same elements start to make sense. They fit, they belong. And that's why John Carter feels so divided. It's not just a difference in opinion, it's a difference in approach. Some viewers meet the film where it is, others expect it to meet them somewhere else. And when those two don't align, the experience breaks. There's also the influence of its source material. Stories like this weren't originally designed with modern genre boundaries in mind. They blended adventure, fantasy, romance, and science fiction without worrying about consistency of tone in the way we expect today. And John Carter reflects that. It shifts between modes, from action to humor, from spectacle to intimacy, from large-scale conflict to personal moments. For some, that feels natural, a reflection of classic storytelling. For others, it feels uneven, a lack of clear identity. And that brings us to the core of it all. Because tone isn't just about style, it's about intention. And John Carter has a very clear intention. It wants to be an adventure first, not a statement, not a reinvention, not a deconstruction, just an adventure, a story you experience, not analyze, a journey you follow, not question at every step. And whether that works for you depends entirely on what you're looking for. Because if you accept that tone, if you embrace the film on its own terms, it becomes something enjoyable, not perfect, not groundbreaking, but engaging. But if you resist that tone, if you expect something else, then the same film starts to feel lacking. And that's the balance John Carter never fully resolves, between what it is and what some people wanted it to be. Which leads to the final question: is the tone of John Carter effective because of its sincerity, or limiting because it refuses to evolve beyond it? Because in the end, this film doesn't ask you to take it seriously. It asks you to believe in it, and whether you do makes all the difference. Big adventure films often aim for the widest audience possible. They want to entertain kids while still keeping adults invested. That balance is difficult, and John Carter is constantly trying to walk that line. On one side, it clearly positions itself as a family-friendly adventure. There's spectacle, there's humor, there are creatures, action sequences, and moments designed to be accessible to younger viewers. It's the kind of film you can watch with a group, friends, family, different ages, and everyone can follow what's happening. It doesn't demand complexity. It doesn't overwhelm with dense themes. It invites you in. And for many viewers, that works. The world is imaginative. The action is engaging. The tone is light enough to make the experience enjoyable without being heavy. From that perspective, John Carter succeeds as a shared experience, something that doesn't exclude anyone, something that feels open. But then, there's the other side. Because while accessibility can be a strength, it can also come at a cost, and that cost is depth. For some viewers, especially adults looking for something more layered, the film doesn't go far enough. The characters don't feel complex enough. The emotional arcs don't hit as strongly as they could. The themes don't fully develop beyond their surface. And when that happens, the experience shifts. Instead of feeling immersed, you start to feel detached. Instead of being pulled into the story, you start observing it. That's where the divide becomes clear. Because younger audiences, or those looking for straightforward adventure, are more likely to engage with what the film offers. The visuals, the action, the clear narrative direction, these elements are enough to carry the experience. But for others, it's not enough. They're looking for stronger emotional investment, more developed characters, more narrative depth. And when they don't find it, the film starts to feel limited, not in scale, but in substance. That's the challenge of broad appeal. The more you try to include everyone, the harder it becomes to fully satisfy anyone looking for something specific. And John Carter reflects that. It avoids being too complex, but in doing so, it sometimes feels too simple. It avoids being too dark, but in doing so, it sometimes lacks intensity. It avoids being too demanding, but in doing so, it doesn't always leave a lasting impact, and that creates two very different experiences. For some, it's a fun, engaging adventure, a film that delivers exactly what it promises. For others, it's a missed opportunity, a story that could have been deeper, more powerful, more memorable. Neither perspective is wrong. They're just coming from different expectations, because the film isn't failing at what it's trying to do, it's just not trying to do everything. It chooses accessibility over complexity, enjoyment over depth, clarity over nuance, and that choice defines how it's received, which leads to the key question: is John Carter successful because it works for a wide audience, or limited because it doesn't fully engage those looking for more? Because in a film like this, the balance between family appeal and adult engagement isn't just a feature, it's a decision, and that decision shapes the entire experience. There's a moment that happens with almost every big science fantasy film, the moment where the audience leans back and starts comparing. This feels like something I've seen before. This reminds me of that other movie, and with John Carter, that moment comes quickly. Because it's almost impossible to watch this film without thinking of others. You see a human entering an alien world, and it echoes Avatar. You see a sprawling interplanetary conflict, strange creatures, political tension, and it brings to mind Star Wars. You see elements of classic adventure, fantasy worlds, heroic journeys, and it connects to films like Willow. These comparisons aren't forced, they happen naturally. Because the language of John Carter, the visuals, the structure, the themes, overlaps with what audiences already recognize. And that creates an immediate reaction. For some viewers, it feels familiar, maybe too familiar. It starts to feel like the film is following a path that's already been explored, a world you've already visited, a story you've already experienced in another form. And when that perception sets in, it changes how the film is judged. Because now it's not being evaluated on its own terms. It's being measured against something else. And that's where John Carter finds itself at a disadvantage. Because those other films, the ones it's being compared to, arrived first in the cinematic space. They defined expectations. They set the standard. They shaped how audiences understand this genre.